Denise is a professor in the School of Public Health at University of Alberta, Canada. She is a medical anthropologist and very active researcher. Her research interests cover migrant worker, of course, gender, development, health, ethnicity, and identity, and the intersecting niches of all these. In this seminar, Denise is going to tell us stories of the lives of remittances and the varied remittance landscape in the Philippines and Indonesia. Remittance itself is often considered a very important part of development for, especially for the countries exporting workers. So, well, we will be looking forward to Denise's very critical lens on these remittances and the development migration nexus in migration studies. Denise.
Thank you. Oh, thank you all very much. And by way of explanation and not apology, I am an old woman with a disability, so I am sitting down. So I feel really bad for the people on Zoom because you get me like full face. But thank you all for being here today, and thank you very much for the warm welcome from CIRC and for Dr. Chan for organizing this forum for us. So we had the pleasure of meeting via Zoom when she came and gave a talk at the University of Alberta. And so it was exciting to have this opportunity to reciprocate and actually meet in person here in Hong Kong. So thank you. I'd like to begin, let's hopefully, by opening up my PowerPoint, which is, yes. Here we go. And we'll want to make it look like a, here we are. Sorry, it's down there. Okay, yeah.
But it's waiting for the words to appear. I don't know why each time it needs some time to.
I just need this, that. Yeah. Okay. All right.
I haven't put it in. We have to put it in.
Okay. Excuse us for this momentary
okay.
technological adjustment.
So
I could tell jokes or something while we're waiting, but that would be pathetic. All right.
But yeah, it's not appearing.
Yeah, but we need to have it turn into the slideshow.
Let me
I think we got that. And then we just, sorry, I think we're here. And there we go. All righty. So if you haven't guessed already, title of my presentation today is Lives of Migrant Remittances, Challenging the Migration and Development Nexus. And as Dr. Chan has noted, I'm a little critical of this idea. So, and I'll hopefully convince you as to why in the next 30 to 40 minutes or so. Now, one of the things that I have importantly learned from the many First Nations and Indigenous scholars and friends in Canada is that you start with acknowledgements rather than because if you truly want to thank people, then do it at the beginning rather than at the end of a talk when everybody is looking at their watches and packing up. Okay, so I do want to sincerely acknowledge the funders for this project, which is the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, otherwise known as SSHRC, and the wonderful people who are a part of the team in Canada, Hong Kong, Indonesia, and the Philippines. And you'll hear a bit more about that team in a moment, but I just want to say again, terima kasih, salamat po, thank you, merci beaucoup, xie xie, whatever. And also huge thanks to the women and men who share their stories and their time with us. So I just want to acknowledge that. All right. I have been working on issues of migration and with migrants, with displaced peoples in Canada, Asia, and the Horn of Africa for over 25 years. And as a medical anthropologist, I've been really interested in how global forces impact individuals and communities of individuals how those global forces are embodied and how people resist them. And so really my work is consistently situated within the context of neoliberal globalization. I think you probably are all very familiar with that term, but just to set the stage, since the 70s, with the restructuring of global economies, the quest for ever cheaper production costs has led to the expansion of global commodity production chains that have taken advantage of cheap labor and cheapening labor throughout the global south. So countries like mine really benefit. We know that the IMF, World Bank have offered loans to countries to facilitate labor flexibilization with conditions outlined in structural adjustment programs where currencies were devalued, spending on social programs reduced, among other consequences. And I have to say, the first time I went to the Philippines was in 1984 as a tourist. But I had been armed with books about the IMF and structural adjustment programs. And actually, I learned more from talking to market women in rural areas than anything from the books I read, because they saw the impact that these programs were having. They were very aware of the conditionalities of these loans and what it was doing to their livelihoods on a very daily basis. So that really, I think, always stayed with me. We know, of course, that there's been displacement from rural areas, that people, we saw increased, many cities saw increased urbanization, and there's a large reserve army of labor that developed that emerged in many of these urban areas. So even today, certainly, precarious employment is very common, even in professional sectors. So I've done research with health professionals in the Philippines, and I'm just going to admit whoever this is here, presuming they're a friend and not foe. And in the people who have like years of experience in the health sector are still working on 6-month contracts. And so there's this constant, precarity is a constant in our lives. So of course, these trends are complicated by historical specificities, colonial relations, and the presence and power of local elites. So that's kind of the context here. Next, if I can move the slide. Maybe. All right. So reinforcing labor export policies, the migration as development or poverty alleviation strategy is really based on the notion that social remittances, so skills and knowledge, including entrepreneurial know-how, will presumably garnered from people's work abroad, and their financial resources will lift their homelands out of economic mire. So, for instance, in one project I did, I was talking to policymakers in the Philippines, and I was told all Filipinos, migrants, can be an entrepreneur at once. But not all of us can be successful entrepreneurs. So, and that was really that caveat was something that the middle level policymakers were willing to share with me, that the people who were promoting these policies at the upper levels never dared to utter. I want to also mention here that, of course, recipient countries are also inveigled with these processes as the obvious beneficiaries of the labor of migrant workers. So it's important that as borders, policies, and procedures surveil and mark bodies as worthy of inclusion or exclusion, the greater likelihood that excluded bodies will be deployed temporarily and disposed thereafter. So in countries like Canada, where we used to host, have many more opportunities for people to resettle permanently, over the last 20 years, the tide has turned, and there's many more people who are coming as temporary workers. So the encouragement of circular and returned migration creates a possibility wherein actually abjection is inverted to become this heroic action. So people are actually excluded from permanent resettlement, but it is seen as something that is beneficial to the to the sending country. So with that aside, let me tell you a little bit about the Lives of Migrant Remittances origin story. I am a storyteller, so you're stuck with the stories here. So the Lives of Migrant Remittances, or LOMR as we call it, is a transnational, academic community research partnership that was conceived of as a collaboration amongst co-learners. We are a collaboration that espouses mutual respect, recognition of knowledge, expertise, and resource capacities of the participants in the process, and open communication where members can critically engage with one another. The genesis, in fact, of the evolution of the initiative that laid the groundwork for this project is kind of evidence of its organic, sorry, I'm admitting people here. I'm going to mute them all. If that's okay. Yes. I have no idea what I'm doing. I hope I haven't offended anyone in the anyways. So this, what basically happened is that I had been doing research in around the global recession in the late, 2008, 2007, 2008. I happened to be I was doing research with Filipino and Indonesian migrant domestic workers in Malaysia when the recession happened, and all of these people were being sent home, sometimes, from not only domestic labor, but from all kinds of other industries, often without being paid. And I began to think about what was happening to those individuals and those families who were dependent upon their wages. So I developed this project called Retrenched and Returned, and engaged people in Hong Kong, Indonesia, and the Philippines in that project. And over the years, after we completed the project, we just stayed in touch, and we would get together and talk about issues that were pertinent to the lives of migrants, and that could be researchable questions. And one of the things that constantly came up was the issue of the migration and development nexus, the idea, again, that people can migrate their way out of poverty. And for the most part, what we saw is that the evidence in support of this strategy was basically using national banking data and the occasional success story, right? And what we wanted to do was to do a research project that engaged people from the ground up. And so we wanted to really kind of find a way to address the gap in our knowledge, be open to whatever we would find as researchers, but to focus our attention on remittances from the perspectives of migrants and their families. Sorry. All right. So you can see how lovely everybody was. We acknowledge, of course, that commitment to equity and social justice really underpins the framing of our research questions, and what we take as evidence and knowledge, including the explicit understanding that migrants are experts on their own lives and their circumstances. And that is, in fact, how we try to interact with one another. We also have really great swag. As you can see, our t-shirts are there because we are worth more than the remittances we send. Were the t-shirts that we used, and you'll see later how we used it. So we really worked at creating an environment where we could challenge each other, where we could find ways of having all of our different perspectives interact in a respectful way, where we acknowledge the humanity in one another, where there was collegiality, and many friendships did emerge from that. We also worked to militate against reenacting the finding actually of Chakravarti, who did a study of South Asian research partners who had worked with people in the global north, and they said they did not find joy in working together. And we really focused on, let's have a joyful collaboration, because the work we're doing is hard. And we really wanted to, again, do robust research, but find joy with our actions with one another. And I think that is also part of the success of the work we did. So we had 4 research objectives, which were to explore how Filipino and Indonesian migrant workers, women and men, who have been or are currently working in diverse occupations in Hong Kong, acquire and deploy both financial and social remittances. To document the impact of these remittances on migrant workers and their families, their local communities, and their national economies. To examine the perspective of Hong Kong, Philippine, and Indonesian public and private stakeholders, and to inform the debate regarding migration and development. So, members of the team, because this was participatory research, so members of the team developed training materials. And one of our colleagues, who was Dr. Julie Ham, who was at the time at the University of Hong Kong, helped along with our community partners to do training so that we had people engaged in data collection and with other migrant workers. And also importantly, these people weren't just data collectors, they were also very much involved in the data analysis and in knowledge mobilization. And so you see here folks obviously in Victoria Park with their beautiful Lives of Migrant Remittances t-shirts and their surveys ready to span the park and get people engaged in doing some of the data collection. So what kind of data did we collect? We used, of course, triangulated multiple methods to both broaden and strengthen our research. And these included a survey with 1,020 participants based on a representative sample of Filipino and Indonesian migrant workers. So we first did a sampling frame looking at gender and occupation of Filipino and Indonesian workers, and we followed that sampling frame to for our survey. We also conducted 45 interviews with policymakers, civil society, remittance and banking industry representatives in Hong Kong, the Philippines, and Indonesia. We held focus groups, 26 of them with 147 people. In Hong Kong, obviously with Filipino and Indonesian migrant workers, but also, again, we went back to follow we wanted to sort of follow the remittances back to people's home villages and their households. So we returned to 3 different locations in the Philippines and Indonesia and talked to people who were handling remittances in their households, as well as people who were returned migrants who had been able to sort of see the results of the remittances they had sent over the years. And so we worked in Indonesia, in Prebes, Ponorogo, and Cilacap, and in the Philippines, in the National Capital Region of Manila, Pangasinan, and Baguio. We also did case studies where we use visuals, using visual stories. So in each of these, the 3 focal communities in both countries, we did more in-depth interviews with a worker in Hong Kong, and then met with their families with more in-depth interviews. And we had the families then take photographs of what remittances meant to them. So we ended up with these 6 visual stories. And of course, we also situated all of the work that we did in the context of a scoping literature review that included sort of policies and programs, etc. So we are swimming in data, and what I'm presenting today is really just the preliminary results of it. Okay. So just to give you an idea of the profile of the survey participants, you can read there for yourselves. Predominantly female. We ended up with slightly more Indonesian than Filipino, which is reverse than the demographic profile. 96.4% were domestic workers. And I don't know if you can see this here, so let me just move this somewhere. I'm just going to remove that. Okay. So you can see that the thing that I think is really interesting is that we often hear that people who are domestic workers in particular are uneducated. And 34% of the people we talk to has had college or university education, right? And we do need to dig a little deeper to kind of, to see sort of how many of those people were domestic workers, but just given the predominance of domestic workers in our survey, we can presume that there were still quite a few who were university educated, and 21% had high school education. The other interesting feature of the survey profile is that 66% had a family history of migrant work, which again speaks to the normalization of migration as an economic strategy in people's households. Right. Next up. I think one of the things that we wondered, because we were, again, focusing on the lives of migrant remittances, and I think if there's one thing that I hope you will take with you today is really when we think about remittances, we really need to broaden the focus so that it isn't just about a financial transaction that can be logged in banking data, but it's really about all of the effort and all of the work that goes into the birth, the generation, and the evolution of remittances. So we often think of them again as this promotion, I guess. Sorry, I'll just step back a moment. So as we know, it's really the promotion of migration as a means of poverty alleviation. The paucity of remunerative employment in home countries really propels the movement of people to seek employment abroad. It's also facilitated by a very well-entrenched recruitment industry. And of course, in the Philippines, also a very strong recruitment industry that is government-led. And obtaining overseas employment requires often payment of recruitment agency fees that in some cases are collected in advance of travel, and for Indonesians, mostly during the period of employment. And a number of people talked about how they leverage funds needed to employ to enable themselves or a family member to go abroad. Some sold off family property, others turned to loans, just mostly starting their migratory journey in debt. So as Remulla, who is a remittance manager from Pangasinan, told us, talking about his wife, he said, "We expense her requirements before working abroad. We don't have anything. We don't even own land to mortgage. We are in debt for the cow that we owned." So not only do migrant workers start out in debt before they leave the country, in some instances, recruitment fees are deducted from salaries for 6 to 7 months, which creates significant challenges, particularly as they endeavor to start and continue to send remittances to their families. What's also really interesting is that very few people told their families about these fees that they were paying. And in fact, when we talked to remittance managers, very few of them, if any, knew that their family member was having these deductions taken from their salaries. So, for example, Ella, who was a former migrant worker from Ponorogo, Indonesia. So these salaries are based on, when we did the data collection was 2020. So the salaries are out of date. But, and also she had been in Hong Kong earlier. So she made 3,500 Hong Kong dollars a month. For the first 6 months, she paid 3,000 Hong Kong as a recruitment fee and sent $400 remittances and had 100 Hong Kong dollars for herself. And again, her family had really, you can imagine trying to survive on 100 Hong Kong dollars for things that you might need, for your daily needs, shampoo, soap that you might not be provided by your employer, extra food, taking an MTR on a Sunday. All of these things would be coming out of that $100. So you can imagine that's pretty difficult. And again, her family had no idea that she was undergoing these kinds of hardships. The other thing I'd mention is that if these recruitment fees, if somebody changes jobs and they move to another recruitment agency, they start with the recruitment fee deductions all over again. So these can be very ongoing issues. So what does it take to produce remittances? At the time, the average monthly salary was $4,410. We know that, of course, that salaries are higher now, but I have to say that I recently was at a presentation where someone had a table of what it costs to rent a parking stall in Hong Kong in all the different neighborhoods. And that monthly parking stall fee still exceeds the amount of money that people pay for a migrant domestic worker. And of course, part of the issue is that families at home think that they are making huge amounts of money because if you translate it from pesos or rupiah, it sounds like a lot, but there's not an understanding of how expensive things are in Hong Kong. So 78.2% worked 6 days a week, 15.8% worked every day, 30.4% worked more than 76 hours a week, and 21.3% worked 56 to 75 hours a week. Many people talked about contract violations, often repeated ones, that included underpayment, non-payment of salaries, unfair wage deductions. For instance, for taking their lawful rest day, they would have funds deducted. And what this also meant was that migrant workers were compelled to borrow money or take out loans in order to fulfill their commitment to sending remittances. As their employment and migration status can be precarious, in addition to the physical and intellectual labor needed to generate remittances, migrant domestic workers are required to engage in emotional and affective labor and self-surveillance. So this refers to the kind of self-suppression of one's own sentiments and demeanor to align with the expectations of your employer. Because the last thing you want to do is basically, I think the fancy term is piss off your employer, right? If you want to stay employed and you want to avoid losing your job, you suppress your emotions, you don't get angry, you don't respond if someone is treating you unfairly. And also watching how you dress, how you comport yourself, how you carry yourself. All of these things are part of one's own self-surveillance to meet the expectations of employers. And one of the things that you're probably familiar with, but I know when I first learned about it, it was a bit of a shock, was knowing how often there is video surveillance in people's homes. And so that means that even when the employer is not at home, and of course with COVID, more people are at home, have been at home, and more people are now working from home. But previously, there's still this sense that you're being observed or potentially being observed. And so there's this constant need to, look like you're working or be working, and to ensure that you're not on the phone or too much, or as your employer determines it, or taking a nap or what have you. So these kinds of stressors we know have significant health effects on both physical and mental health. And of course, with the 2-week rule at the time, I know it's longer now, precarity is embedded in the entire system. So again, if you lose your job or you change, need to change jobs because of contract violations or other forms of abuse, it puts you at a disadvantage, and you're constantly again being requested funds. So the other important thing again is that your family at home does not know about this. There's a silence that exists both for people's hardships at home and for people's hardships overseas. So as Stephanie, a Filipino migrant domestic worker in Hong Kong, said, it isn't as easy as they usually see on social media, that you're happy on your days off. They have no idea how much you struggle for your everyday just so you can work for them. So I think Stephanie sums that up quite effectively. Let's talk a little bit about how people budget for remittances. Remittances from basically most people, nearly 90% send remittances monthly. And there's often a really significant amount of effort that is taken to understanding how to send remittances, where to send remittances, what's the best place, what's the best venue, what's the best channel. So constantly weighing costs, interest rates, convenience, accessibility for receiving families. And so I have to say that some of the most financially literate people I've ever met are migrant workers in Hong Kong, because they are in fact very aware of things like exchange rates and you know, what currency fluctuations, etc. So sometimes I hear about, you know, well, they just need greater financial literacy, and I'm rather, I would suggest, in fact, that people are very financially savvy. At the time, again, the median amount of money that people sent was about 2,500, which is about 50% of their salaries. Yang, who is a Filipino migrant domestic worker in Hong Kong, said, "My child receives my remittances. She's now in grade 12. The salary is really expensive, so I send about 70% of my salary." So both remittance managers and migrant workers acknowledged that families would face considerable hardship without the infusion of migrant remittances. And if migrant workers are unable to send adequate funds, particularly for emergency expenses, they borrow money from others to ensure that those requests are fulfilled. Migrant remittance managers at home also rely on loans from neighbors or family members who have stable employment if they experience shortfalls. So in both cases, a larger network of personal and for-profit actors are often involved in sustaining that flow of remittances, and potentially social, and that also means that there are often social and material indebtedness to a larger network of people. So producing and ensuring the flow of remittances is, again, not an individual responsibility. So how are remittances used? And as you can see here, for the most part, remittances are used for daily expenses. 81.3% used them for food. The next most common use, nearly 71%, was for school fees and tuition, and that could be either for your own children or those of other relatives. Less than 50% said they used, the funds were used for housing, which could include repair, rent, or mortgage. And then there were household items, utilities, and medical expenses. I draw your attention to the issue of loans. 23% or almost 24% of the remittances were directed towards loans. And as I've mentioned, you know, in order to leave the country, people may be taking out loans in order to find those money for those placement fees. Business investment, which is supposed to be the raison d'etre of this migration and development paradigm, was listed at 5.8%. 5.8% of the funds of nearly 1,000 people were being directed towards something in business investment and entrepreneurship. So when we asked these questions in a variety of different ways in the survey, and one of the questions we asked was, what were your top 10 priorities for sending remittances? Business investment was a first priority for 1.1% of the folks. So it didn't even appear as a second priority for any of the people that we talked to. So again, food, tuition, the most important priorities, suggesting that remittances are generally used for basic survival. And again, this actually is reinforced by other studies that were done on this issue. So what we are, you know, experiencing is not unheard of. So how do migrants manage remittances? The management of financial and other material remittances is, of course, complex and transnational, involving, as I've mentioned, not only the sender and recipient, but host of other family members, friends, neighbors, who make claims on the funds or goods that people might send, who may be asked to loan money when remittance shortfalls occur or when emergencies occur. And In addition, migrant workers consider where to direct remittances and their frequency, as well as what kind of remittances to send. So those sending remittances is an important impetus for labor migration. Delivering on that promise is an important method of demonstrating filiality, but it can at times be fraught. So Hannah here said, before I started working here in Hong Kong, I used to work in Singapore and London. The salary there is quite bigger, to which I've learned my lesson. I used to leave it up to them on how they would spend remittances. When I got home, I didn't see anything. There were even debts under my name that I didn't know of. Now I'm really strict with my remittances. I decided to have a breakdown of the budget since I'm not the only one anymore who's an earner for the family. So some of the work of migrant remittances is dealing with how these remittances are managed. So, trying to see once they're transferred, whether how they are might be a useful resource. And so, in part, you're giving those funds over to family members, but in part, because you've put so much effort into it, you still feel a sense of domain over it. And it's very difficult, as you can imagine, to negotiate that with family members, people that you love. And I can tell you, I'm a pretty fierce old lady, and I sent remittances to my mother until she passed. There's no bloody way I would have the temerity to tell her how to spend her money that I sent her, right? And yet we see this is something that people have to do all the time. And as a result, there can be some, potential tensions within the family when people ask for things like oversight over how things are dispersed. Sometimes people have said, okay, here's a budget, I want to see receipts. And so there's always this kind of dance between how much you request those things and how much you just let it go and just hope for the best because you don't want to upset your family member. So one of the things that Audrey, and all of these names I should add are pseudonyms, of course, who's a representative from Hong Kong civil society, said that it's really the hope of migrant workers and their families and their dreams for a better life for the next generation that sustained them through years of hardship and separation from family, friends, and homelands. She said, apart from providing for their basic needs, remittances also helps them. It gives them a sense of empowerment, that they will be able to generate income for their family, that their remittances actually equated to hope. It's a given hope to their family back home. That's why every time an OFW, overseas Filipino worker, leaves the Philippines, you see troops of relatives sending her to Hong Kong, because everyone is pinning their hopes on this person who left the Philippines to work abroad and make their lives easier. So that is basically what remittances does to the migrant workers. It gives them a sense of hope that the next generation, probably their children, will not become a migrant worker. So again, the work of remittances is exhausting, and it's also an exhaustive effort that's assuaged to different extents by performance, as I've mentioned, of filial duties and the desire to provide for families. Outmigration also means that migrant workers forfeit or sublimate their own aspirations, including delaying or foregoing further education, asserting their reproductive choices, fulfilling occupational familial roles in favor of familial responsibilities that require separation from them. So prioritizing familial demands often entails self-sacrifice, which is a critical feature of gender ideologies, particularly as women who are expected to not hesitate to put others' needs ahead of their own. Furthermore, outmigration is encouraged. Women migrant workers are also deemed as suspect. They can be seen as neglecting their duties to husbands, children, parents. And also there's this undercurrent of discourse that they are promiscuous or potentially promiscuous when they go abroad. And so sending remittances is also a way of countering that discourse, of continually reestablishing yourself as a dutiful daughter, as a good wife, as a good sister or a good mother. And this discourse really helps to support and naturalize the continually sending of remittances. In some countries, like in Indonesia, the eldest daughter is particularly tasked with serving this role. And some people told me, honestly, families treat their eldest daughters like milking cows, which is a pretty horrific thing to say, but I heard it numerous times. So let's talk a little bit about some other kinds of remittances, because in addition to financial remittances, people send material remittances. And there's also the issue of social remittances, which I'll talk about just very briefly. So material remittances in the form of care packages can be anything from soap, foods, toys, clothing, anything that's kind of integral to sustaining familial and community ties and well-being. And sort of like the acquisition and deployment of financial remittances, it also involves physical and emotional labor. So people talked about how they really thought hard about what they wanted to include in these boxes that they would send home. So thinking about the needs and expectations of recipients. So, and as these materials also carry migrant senders' affection through this process. So Leah, who is a returned migrant worker in Pangasinan, said, going to sale places, picking nice things, keeping them and sending them back home, it gave her a sense of pleasure. But material remittances are also a means of earning management. So Josephine, who is a returned migrant worker from Baguio, said that when they were still in Hong Kong, they sent packages monthly because it was better than sending money, because the family members would, from their perspective, squander it. And we also heard, although we heard often positive and effective responses regarding material remittances, many said that those needed to be weighed again with other impacts and the social cost of migration. So we hear again from Lynn, who said, lost time can't be brought back. The effect on our family wasn't good. We did not have a good relationship with my dad, who had also been a migrant worker. I wouldn't want that to happen to my children. It also happened to my friends. I also hear it from others. You really can't replace lost time and presence with material gifts. So when we talk about social remittances, we're talking about sort of skills, ideas, talents that people are thought to accrue from working and living overseas that are meant to be transferred back either to their families or through themselves when they return. We asked quite a few questions about these, and I'm just going to share a couple because we asked people about what they learned working and what they learned living in Hong Kong and how they transferred those. So, and not everyone in the survey answered all the questions, so you see the end number is changed a bit. But as you see here, really some of the things people learned most from working in Hong Kong were new languages and cultures, learning how to get along with people, various working related skills, organizing time, but also standing up for their rights. When we ask people, what was most helpful to you? 63.4% said self-confidence, that was one of the things that they really gained by working in Hong Kong. Nearly 50% said learning to help others. Over 43% said they developed greater social awareness. And 33% said they learned more about political action. 10% said they learned something about starting a business. So when we ask people, what new ideas did they learn from living in Hong Kong? So this is about living in Hong Kong as opposed to working here. Again, understanding culture and diversity was the most prominent idea that they learned, followed by environmental awareness. But interestingly, the next was increasing understanding of politics and globalization. And so I think that's kind of interesting when we think about how the entrepreneurship and business development is supposed to be the primary reason, social remittance that they're coming back with, but instead it's about sort of social issues, living with others, understanding perhaps more about the social and political landscape in which they're living and their place in it, which I think is quite interesting. When we ask people about whether they share these ideas with others, 85% said they did, and fully 100% said that they found they were able to express themselves more effectively to others, and that this was really one of the most important things that they learned by going overseas. So despite these new ideas and skills that migrant workers have garnered, years apart, as we know, can be very trying, unfamiliar relations, and also in one's position in our home countries. Migrant workers spoke about yearning to be together with their families, in particular for those with children to watch them develop. They opined that although they might have the love of fathers, children need the love of a mother who is present with them. And again, although the remittances is supposed to be an embodiment of love and hope for family and children, tensions, of course, arise with regards to children's care, as well as marital relations, which are, of course, reconfigured. And also when women are shifting into the breadwinning role for the family, can also be a new kind of role for men and heterosexual couples to negotiate. Sometimes partners find another spouse, or there are other potential fractures that occur. Children can also feel quite isolated from their migrant worker parent. So Monette, who was a remittance manager, was a young man in Baguio, shared that when his mother came back, there was a time she didn't even know who my sister was, that my sister was a baby when our mom left. And the long years of separation can also impact women's mothers' emotional attachment to their children. We hear again from Leah, who said, I can't feel the closeness in me, even if they're far without communication. I don't miss them. Although they're saying, I love you, but I feel cold. I worked overseas for so many years and I left them with their father. Ramul, who was again a remittance manager from Pangasinan, described how his neighbors presumed that they were wealthy because his wife was an overseas worker. Yet these individuals, again, had no knowledge of the amount of either the remittances that they were sent, nor of the daily expenses that his wife had to endure, and failed to comprehend that they, in fact, strictly budgeted their funds to receive that they received, and there were often shortfalls. So here I'm talking about sort of not the response of the community and the impact on return. Some of the focus group respondents came home with no funds after selling all of their money as remittances, and were thus regarded by their neighbors and the community as quote unquote unsuccessful. Some found that they were given absolutely no credit for the tangible benefits that their remittances brought over the years, like, you know, sending their siblings to school or doing house repairs. And they felt faced with a sense of ingratitude for the immense efforts that they had made and a lack of understanding of the immense efforts that they'd made. The reliance on remittances and the expectation that overseas migrant workers are wealthy meant that some returned migrants were still expected to provide regular remittances, and that migrant workers who were accustomed to providing them, in fact. So Josephine, who was a returned migrant domestic worker from Baguio, illustrated this situation. So she said, they complained why I came back because they weren't getting what they wanted anymore. Now it's getting better. When my income came back, so she started to find work in Baguio again, I couldn't help but give part. I think I just got used to giving. So again, this dramatic disparity between expectations and the reality of migrants and migrant households further contributed to tensions that require negotiations, but were nonetheless unsettling when people reintegrate into their home communities. Right. Getting close. So the discourse that migrant workers are national heroes is in part which is something that follows from the migration and development nexus, that people are going overseas and they're, you know, making our households and our country rich. is in part predicated on the notion that remittances will, again, improve conditions for their families in the next generation. But when we ask people, what was it worth it? And they assessed the personal and the social costs of their migratory journey. The actual reply was no. So as Marcella said, if you look closely, migration really doesn't help families. You chase for a small amount of money there while you're also being chased by problems here in the Philippines. Which is better, to make problems or to make money that's not big that you can also earn in the Philippines? So this notion that, again, migration is promoted as a strategy for national development and poverty alleviation is regarded as a triple win for migrants, for receiving countries and for their home countries. So this, notion that people are economic heroes responsible for economic prosperity of their families and their nation. But again, our study illustrates this is a very heavy burden and one that does not make visible all of the challenges faced by migrants and their families, all of the work that is required to produce and to live with and manage remittances, especially when we think about the social costs of long-term separation from families and friends and home communities, in addition to low wages and harsh working conditions over time. And overall, our participants, when we asked them about this discourse, rejected this label. As Sati, a returned migrant worker from Puerto Rico, said, that name, economic heroes, it's an irony. It appears that they're proud of us and give us a glorious label. However, in reality, the states don't give us any proper protection. They push us to an abyss, and nobody can help us when we face difficulties. Even though they say that we are under protection of law, the law does not give us protection. In the end, migrant workers have to fight by themselves. We don't need that label. Instead, the government must protect people who work abroad well and create clear laws to help migrants. Honestly, I don't disagree with migration because in reality, the government can't provide us enough places for us to work here. So we have to work abroad. And yes, the money the government gets from remittances may be used to develop the country. But what do we get? We still have to pay for expensive school tuition fees and health care. We don't get anything, and we have to work hard for our money. So, although just briefly wrap up here, although the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration is the recognized framework for improved migration governance, asserts that migration should not be driven by economic necessity due to the inability of people to engage in remunerative employment opportunities in their home country. Poverty-induced outmigration remains a reality in both the Philippines and Indonesia, where an often educated workforce is destined to take up lower skilled positions out of country. The Migration and Development Nexus promotes the notion that migrant remittances will lead to this triple win of economic benefits. However, much of the evidence support of this discourse comes, as I've said before, from national level economic data, small-scale research, and individual success stories. Our research focusing on the lives of migrant remittances as they travel across national borders from migrant workers to their home local communities and families illustrates how remittances are produced, managed, and distributed. We argue that it's critical to make visible the immense physical, affective, and emotional labor required of migrant remittances and often their familial and kin networks in the life cycle of these remittances. The work begins even before migrant workers depart their homelands, as both expectations about the benefits they will bring are established and demands for recruitment or replacement fees produce financial demands that may sometimes require loans. These fees will diminish their salaries and contribute to economic precarity upon receiving initial salaries. Some worry about whether they can fulfill their duties to remittance recipients in these circumstances or even in the events of emergency. Remittance sending is an act of filiality or love. Further self-abnegation as familial needs and desires are given precedence over those of migrant workers, particularly women. The work of migrant remittances requires a sophisticated knowledge of financial matters, of the changing remittance industry, including its myriad technologies and of market, as they try to obtain the most suitable balance between cost and location, both for themselves and remittance recipients.
Thus, decisions about where and how to send remittances is not an individual consideration that may be predicated actually on employers' control over workers' rest days, preferences of recipients, and trust in the infrastructure required to support remittance and banking options. The uptake of remittances takes a village. It involves both senders and recipients who may be engaged in negotiations around the deployment of financial resources. Some migrant workers expend considerable effort to direct remittances, sometimes after learning or fearing that remittances were squandered or misdirected, whilst others may entrust them to the household remittance manager. Reflecting results of other studies, remittances from Indonesian migrant workers in Hong Kong, again, were primarily directed towards basic subsistence and education. One of the things that I'd like to mention is the fact that while as a professor, I certainly support education, in other research I've done, we've shown that education, of course, does not necessarily lead to decent jobs. And so we have to be thinking beyond the notion that people are getting an education. What ends up happening in many cases that we end up with an overeducated workforce that is sent overseas and immediately de-skilled. So that's another thing that I think we need to be more critical of that idea. The notion that we can bank on people using remittances for business investment, as I've said, in other studies have demonstrated that return migrant entrepreneurship has very high failure rates, with limited impact on financial stability and upward mobility. And all of these interactions are embedded in the trajectory of migrant remittances that can be a source of stress as well as satisfaction, but which all have an impact on intrafamilial and intercommunity relations. Some face the opprobrium of community members and some family members who make presumptions about wealth, success, and failure of returned migrants and remittance managers. So as we've documented in this project, through their acquisition, accumulation, and deployment of remittances, migrants and transnational families continue to be responsibilized for the attainment of economic development and imposed in an often obscure duty that comes with physical, social, and emotional costs. Interestingly, none of our interlocutors wanted their own children to follow in their footsteps. Notably, migrants and their transnational families in Baguio case study expressed that migration is a sad decision made out of a lack of life opportunities in our home country. Indonesian migrant managers in Cilacap and Prebes respectively shared, migration is not a guarantee for success, and remittances will never be enough to lift people out of poverty. So in conclusion, our data suggests, of course, that remittances are a multifaceted phenomenon with temporal and spatial dimensions that are produced, distributed, and managed by migrant workers, remittance managers, and respective extended families and communities across national borders and over time. They're, of course, embedded with cultural and individual meetings that are often gendered and shaped by various government and policy, private industry policies and practices. Given the work of remittances, their particular valence, and their positioning within household, national, and global networks and discourses, the social implications are vital to our consideration of the lives of migrant remittances. Remittance centers and receivers are constructed as agents bearing access to global financial markets and tasked with development process. So development, of course, and I'm not the first person to say this, of course, has been transformed from a national state responsibility into becoming an individual risk of migrants and transnational families and communities. And this powerful discourse of migration and development holds that remittance senders and recipients are accountable, also conditions them and their kin and their neighbors to hold themselves accountable for the future well-being and development of their families and their communities, and also for their own failures. So I think that in the end, when I have been in the last number of months, I've been going around with my team members to various places throughout the Philippines and Indonesia to share our findings. For the most part, people have been quite receptive, though I will share that at one point, a Filipino policymaker challenged what I had to say, although she had, to be honest, she had missed the part where we talked about our methodology and how many people we spoke to. And she said, you know, you people should really do a longitudinal study. And I said, well, in fact, the returned migrants that we talked to had been away on average 20 years. So we were, you know, did not have the resources to do a longitudinal study, but they were able to observe changes in their household livelihoods over time, as well as the remittance managers at home could attest to it. But I also said, you know, it's interesting, there has been a labor export policy in the Philippines for how many years, right? And surely they were probably in the best position to determine whether there were changes in socioeconomic status over this large populace over time. So she, in fact, was a little hard pressed to come up with evidence to the contrary. And yet, what's very, for me, very interesting is that this discourse remains so entrenched in all of these our populations, that we still support this discourse over time. So I think that we really need to think about ways to dispel this narrative, hold accounts, governments, both North and South, and international monetary institutions, private sector interests, accountable for the structural inequities that underpin not just precarious labor, but precarious lives, from which they benefit and I benefit as a person who lives in the global North. One of the things I will say, that when we share these findings, one thing we all agree on is that we all want to live in a world where migration is truly a choice for people and not something that they are compelled to do. So I will leave you with that. Thank you.
Okay, so let's have some question of time for discussion, and maybe I invite the hands from the room first, and later on when we have time, if we have time, we will also have a few questions from the Zoom audience. Okay, so anyone want to ask question? 1, 2, 3.
Advice to the lovelorn, you know, I can handle all kinds of things. So.
Those who are on Zoom, do you mind like using those icons, raise your hand, something like that, to alert us?
I think Mark had a question.
Mark.
Yeah, thanks very much for that talk that gave us this thick descriptive understanding of the phenomenon that goes beyond some of these more flat economic analysis. I mean, of course, talking about the case of the Philippines, as you know, economists will say this is 10% of our economy.
Right.
And we can't live without this. If that 10% would go away, that would be, so that's, you know, the macro macro argument. And, you know, during COVID, there was some disruptions because obviously in some places migrants had to return. So that's the macro picture, which, you know, again, use the Philippine case. It's been government policy, official government policy since at least the 70s.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and as you say, it's continued and it's gotten larger and larger. The second issue is, you know, the question of migration governance. And, you know, you raised some questions that have been talked about a lot in the Hong Kong case about, you know, these agencies that take exorbitant fees and so on. There's been discussion in both the Philippines and Indonesia, as well as in Hong Kong itself, and some scandals here probably have come across. One thing, of course, there in the comparative context, talk to Filipino migrants in particular, they'll say better here than the Middle East.
Yeah.
So whatever the problems of, you know, migration governance, and also the, you know, the fact that this sounds like very unreasonable working hours, but the 1 day off here was considered an advance over, say, a place like Singapore.
Yeah, and I work in Malaysia, so it's even worse there. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. So I mean, migration governance, another issue, and Hong Kong actually is not the worst. It should be better, certainly in terms of wage levels and so on. And the third point I wanted to raise is, so I found it implicit in some of what you were describing the migrants was saying to your team, and that is the middle class aspirations. So one perception of migrants in Hong Kong, at least in the general community, this is a kind of a external working class that's come in to take, very difficult jobs that obviously locals would not be interested in taking. And yet from the context of their own countries and communities, given the exchange rates and so on, this is a middle class profession. In fact, the wages would be higher than many college professionals would get, at least right out of college. So that, even if the pay is not great, it is enough to attract incentives. And then I come to this issue of education. That I think that's a real driving force, as you say. They want to be able to help their children be able to have the in-country dream rather than having to migrate. And so I think that besides the poverty-induced migration, as you mentioned, which is obviously related, is this middle-class aspiration. And of course, this runs into all sorts of difficulties with remittances, the way they're treated by the family, as you rightly say. And there's been a lot of research on this. I'm sure in the Indonesian case, but also in the Philippine case, disappointment of migrants with the way their family, the expectations, unrealistic expectations, and so on. But I just want to maybe underline as the final comment that to me is what one of the drivers is, and is completely misunderstood in the Hong Kong context, and also the high levels of college education. So these are people who have often themselves achieved quite substantially, but unfortunately didn't find adequate or positions equivalent to the qualifications at home. So that seems to be an important driving force. What's going on.
Do you want me to respond to it, or you want
Do you
to
want
take
to?
Isabel's? Sure.
Do you want to
Sure.
make some response?
First of all, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think what I'm trying to say is that there needs to be more pressure given to sending countries to clean up their own inequalities, right? And that I think that in part it also means that countries like Canada, who are recipients of migrant workers, need to also be more critical of our own policies that again are taking people, for instance, recruiting health professionals and having them work in jobs in which they are de-skilled. So 63% of Filipino workers who came to Canada under the auspices of the Live-in Caregiver Program, which is have university education, compared to 36% of the economic immigrants to my country, right? And so, we have to be thinking about what's the driver of that, right? And if people, and they have actually made some changes to that program, so people no longer have to live with their employers, but they've also added, before people could be under the program for a number of years and then resettle permanently in Canada, and that was often the carrot, and Canada needs people. But now they've actually made it more difficult for people to settle, even though you can now come with your family. It's just become more challenging. And I have to ask myself, why do we need all these people to be engaged in care work and domestic work if people were, if people did their fair share in the household? Then maybe we could reduce the number of people who are actually required to do that. So, in Canada, when we have years ago, and I'm sure it's in the census tracked how much work women, and again, the binaries are problematic, but the statistics were dichotomous, women and men. Women work 13 months a year when you include paid and unpaid labor. So I think we have to really be thinking about sort of, again, the gender dimension of these things, how people are recruited through a gendered and racialized international division of labor, and how those workers are again slotted into temporary work, more precarious work, and maybe we all need to have, hold up a mirror to ourselves to ask why these flows are particularly necessary and what they mean for people. So what else did I can't remember what else I was going to say, but yeah.
Can I just make one other comment? One of the most famous Filipino movies of recent times is called Hello, Love, Goodbye, about a Filipino migrant to Hong Kong who then goes on to Canada.
Right.
So,
Yeah. No, and
Canada is like the ultimate.
Oh, absolutely. And you're quite correct that, Hong Kong is, a much better situation than the Middle East or Singapore and the work I've done in Malaysia. But the question is it still good enough? And why is it that people live here for 20 or 30 years and they can't settle here permanently? And one of the other issues that I think when we have people who have been away for 20 or 30 years, they return to their homes, and the communities have moved on, your family has moved on. And also when we think about the pressures for people to be entrepreneurs, the studies show that when you are people who are effective migrant entrepreneurs are people who have social capital remaining in the community. And when you've been away for such a long period of time, that's dissipated. And from my just observations, and I'd be curious to know what you found, Yukwa, is that the people who had been able to do some variety of entrepreneurship have been people who have joined up with other migrant organizations in Indonesia and the Philippines that have provided that kind of, created networks and friendships rather than relying on the natal relationships before. So I think, it's really complicated, and yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Let's invite a question from the Zoom. I think Isabel, you want to ask a question?
Yes, thank you. Hello. Yes, thank you. I'm based in Portsmouth, and very nice to join this presentation. Thank you very much for the very informative and useful presentation. I have, if that's possible, I have 3 questions. And the first one is that you just, for Dennis, you just addressed the issue of a return migrant go beyond their family setting and becoming part of the community. So my interest is on the social remittance. To what extent you think someone could go beyond that, apart from being able to self-express and having network and social capital, cultural capital, become an activist? And another direction is, from being an activist, someone can also start working in the brokering industry. Someone can actually choose, with those social capital, cultural capital, knowledge, become someone who works in the brokering industry. May not be necessarily a broker herself or himself, but somehow part of the business. And the third question is actually something you mentioned just now about Canada. I was wondering, because the fact that these people stay abroad 20, 30 years is because they are in East Asia. This is the guest worker system where workers are not allowed to stay. But with that, even just slight prospect, I heard what you said, that maybe the prospect of becoming integrated into Canada, America, or the UK have been diminished a bit. But to what extent you think that kind of prospect can somehow complicate the practice of remittance? What I meant is, would that be somehow replacing remittance, that you can actually sponsor someone to stay in where you are? So these are my questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Isabel. I hope I can answer all of them. In terms of the issues around, migrants, and I think we're familiar, we share a lot of the same networks. So I think we've seen a lot of success with people who have been, sharing their, have shared experience and are able then to use those kinds of lessons and strengths for one another to launch, small scale opportunities, and even just to provide, support for one another, so that they understand that what they're going through is not unusual. And if I can just get back to something that Mark mentioned about middle class aspirations, and I'm probably drawing from memory here, and since I'm really old, I don't know whether this is correct, how accurate it is anymore. But from what I recall, remittances were lifting people in Indonesia at least to the poverty line, and just maybe a little bit over. So in fact, these were not middle class aspirations. These are can I eat today aspirations. So I think that and I used to use the line that when Filipino kids were reunited with their families in Canada, they all thought that their mothers were living in a castle. What they find is they come to Canada and their mothers are cleaning the castle. And in fact, they're living in a basement suite. And the kind of toys that they got, the electronics they got, that they thought made them, rise into the middle class, in fact, were like extremely dated. They were the cheapest things. And in fact, kids were really ridiculed for just having the wrong version of, the whatever technology or toy they had. So sorry, that was a bit of an aside. Activism and brokering. It's very, I don't know how much I can say about that. Certainly, the people I know are not interested in going into that space, but in the in Canada, I have met numerous people who had been live-in caregivers who have opened up their own recruitment agencies and have been involved with that. And it's I can't say that that it's always well regarded in that respect. I do recall interviewing some people who were recruitment agents in Indonesia many years ago. And when I asked them, would you send your, they were telling me all these great things about how it's wonderful to be a migrant worker and blah, blah, blah. And I said, would you send your kids? Would you send your daughter? And the answer was absolutely not. I don't want this for my kid, though I'm happy to, to make money off of it. So I think that one of the things, again, that is one of the social remittances that people are coming back with is, again, a bit more of a critical view of the social and political landscape, and that having the kind of activism that many people, I know, it has really helped to kind of keep that critique front and center. And about replacing remittances. One of the things that was very interesting, years ago, I did a study of pre-departure orientation programs for migrant workers who are going to Canada. And so I attended the ones in the Philippines that were mandatory at the time, and I attended the Canadian one, which was offered at the time, Canadians over orientation abroad. And in that program, they said, okay, everyone go home tonight and tell your family you're not going to send remittances. And of course, nobody did, right? But they would sit down with like a budget and say, this is how much you think you're making. This is how much things cost in Canada. You're going to have no money at the end of the day. And if you're going to save money to bring your family over, you cannot send them remittances for 3 years. And of course, absolutely nobody paid any attention to this because their family wanted remittances and needed remittances right away, right? And so what was really interesting is when I did a study as well of family reunification in Canada, is that a lot of the children said, I'm going to keep sending remittances to my family. That they saw this in part as part of their own sense of retaining a Filipino identity, and that they saw what it meant in keeping those connections with their family in the Philippines, and that even ones who were born in Canada said, we want to carry that tradition onwards. So so it was interesting that in fact continued forward. So thanks for that question. I hope I answered it.
Well, I want to make a comment from the previous discussion. The fact that Hong Kong has a better environment, maybe for migrant workers, part of the reason is we have a lot of NGOs and labor unionists helping, taking care of the workers. And now in this audience here, we have some NGO workers who take care a lot of, work a lot with the migrant workers. May I invite you guys to talk about your experience and then also maybe make some questions to Denise. Tanya, you want to go first?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Tanya. I'm from Peace Direction. So basically our organization helping the migrant workers from all nationalities. Yeah. Thank you for the presentations. Yeah, this is always the issue. And then while you do the presentation, basically when I first sit down, actually I'm telling myself and my friends, I said working as a migrant novice people will not make the migrant novice worker becoming rich. So basically this is only the chance for them to provide their dream, to provide a better life for their next generation. Will not go through the same situation like that. Yeah, not and also for their parents. Right. So this is actually what they dream. There's a lot of migrant workers from India. Some are illiterate, from Sri Lanka also. We actually assisting the migrant workers from Sri Lanka, the men who does not speak English or Cantonese at all. Yeah. So, well, also there's an Indian lady. First, when she came to Hong Kong, it's actually 1 day after her 18 years old birthday. And so basically, this migration thinking help the migrant workers to come up from one up level.
Yeah.
So one up level only, but most of them is whether this is really giving a way up for them, not really also, because some of them that stuck in here, they're becoming a provider because thought that they can, maybe come for several years, provide, then the family will, can bring the family up from the poverty or can be stand up by themselves, but in fact it's not, because some of the needs of the family dragging them down because there's no word stop. Yeah. So that's why they keep providing, and while the other part, they keep giving, and then the other party keep receiving, and they then stuck in here for 20 years, 11 years, and when they go back, really there's nothing. That's why I think basically that recently this year I'm thinking that we need to change their mindset. Most of the remittance that's sent back to their family is used for the unproductive thing. And then this is the thing that's why they never be able to save money. And this is the thing that create a lot of loans. They need to take money from the finance company and other things. So long way to go. Yeah, but how to say because I'm dealing with this issue for 20 years already.
Yeah.
So I've been working in this field for 22 years now. That's why, and then the situation is almost the same. So yeah, but again, thank you.
Thank you. Can I just ask you, what do you mean by unproductive things?
Like, they need help, very big one, So this is the thing, we need to change that mindset, we need to teach them. You've been to Indonesia, and then Philippines also. Sometimes because of their culture, they don't mind with their neighbors, what the neighbor says. Because some neighbor will do the comment like, you're working overseas, but they still have very little house. So then when they will earn money, they build a very good big house. Just to prepare the neighbor to say something like, you are unsuccessful, even though you're working at the same. So we need to change their mindset. We need to teach them actually how to use your money productively. Especially like now, what I try to look out for them is like this. In all time, all the children stay together or maybe in the same village because because transportation in the country is not like nowadays. But nowadays, so that's why our parents have a big house. So all the children can stay together. That's why we need a big house. But nowadays, because of the transportation, technology thing, every children will not have. Even though you have a big house, you only have 2 people in the house. So why you wasting money for this? So this is the thing that we try to put in their mind. You just need to have something that is really needed for you now, and you need to allocate that to the other needs, because otherwise, again, like I say, all the salary will go to unproductively. So
Thanks.
that's what I'm saying. The life of the migrant workers is quite difficult in a way, and sometimes they really need to be provided with the skill. Honestly. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing.
Vivi, you want to add to that?
It's I agree with what Tanya said. I think we all know that for migrant women, especially for domestic workers, migrant domestic workers, they migrate is out of necessity, out of choice. So they also because of the promoted by the employment agency and by the government. So it's I feel like especially for Indonesia. So if I think you already mentioned as well that the employment how the employment agency the way the employment agency work. So like it's not really people in the village who really want to escape poverty and become migrant workers, but because it's also promoted to them, and even though it's like, for example, we can say like government endorse migration or whatever, but the restriction also for the domestic workers, migrant domestic workers, different with other migrant workers.
Yes.
So this is why it's like never ending stories. As long as as long as it is seen as government program, for example, or this for the development as well. So the migrant worker, just become I don't know, like part of it, even though their contribution is also it's also substantial to the development. But I mean, like I think you know about the remittance issue for from the migrant ministry. We send remittance to our countries. For example, Indonesia is a contribute to our economy, like some billion next year, but nothing happened with the different life changing.
Yeah,
better life for the migrants.
absolutely. Thank you.
Well, it's already should be the ending of this seminar. May I just ask for one more question? One more? Okay, Unica.
Thanks for the presentations. I would like to ask, you mentioned in the conclusion part, you said that triple wins. Are you think that the recipient country and sending countries are the winners, but the domestic helper is the only loser? Do you agree with that?
That's a good question. And I would say one of the things is that if you were a taxpayer in Philippines or Indonesia or other, sending countries, you have an investment in each other's education and each other's health and well-being. And when you send people abroad, you don't benefit from that. So, I mean, the work we were doing with migration of health professionals in the Philippines, people training, physicians training as nurses to then go overseas to work as nursing assistants, is, you know, the sending country is not winning there, right? So I think that we really need to, you know, be thinking about that cost as well. And I, you know, sometimes I bristle at using these kind of economic terms, but really, you know, it's a social investment as well as a financial investment in each other when we're in a society. And when that is being sort of removed, and, you know, there is a WHO recruiting, you know, code that virtually no country adheres to, right? So we should be, you know, Canada benefits tremendously from foreign trained nurses and foreign trained physicians, but we don't actually, you know, compensate resending countries as we're supposed to. So I think, who is it that wins? I don't know. So I'm thinking that.
You want to say something? Okay, we should end here. Let's give a big applause to the collection. Okay,
Thanks again. Yeah.
okay, we will end the Zoom meeting now.
Thank you, folks, for being on Zoom and for